I'll never forget the flicker in Dan's eyes, not anger, not sadness, but confusion. That moment, in our Cincinnati bedroom, ignited a fire neither of us could extinguish. Dan had just finished, and as usual, I lay staring at the ceiling, not satisfied but hollow, an emptiness growing like dust in the corners of my mind. I expected guilt to consume me, but instead, I met his gaze and spoke the words that changed everything. "You're not enough."
He blinked once, twice, then pulled on his boxers and sat at the bed's edge, his back to me. He didn't shout or cry. He just said, "Then I'll find someone who is." We'd been married 12 years, 12 quiet, comfortable, emotionally barren years. Dan Sullivan, my financial advisor husband, was the type to pay bills early, schedule sex for Sundays, and kiss my forehead instead of my lips. I tried everything: new lingerie, flirty texts, online tutorials about rekindling passion after a decade. Nothing worked. I was starving in a house full of food I no longer craved. So I said it. After one of his routine 3-minute sessions, as he rolled off and flipped on ESPN, I stared at his back and whispered, "Dan, you're not enough anymore." He thought I meant emotionally. Maybe I wanted more dates or affection. But I clarified I needed more in the bedroom, not just variety, but intensity, power, dominance, something raw and primal. He stood, walked to the bathroom without a word, and I thought that was it. Maybe he'd ask for a divorce or move out. But Dan had another plan. 2 nights later, I entered our living room and froze. Isaiah Reed and Malcolm Tate sat on our couch. 2 tall, powerful black men radiating confidence like a storm. Isaiah's tribal tattoos curled up his arm, his gaze slow and piercing. Malcolm wore a silver chain necklace, his smile bold and warm. Dan stood beside them, his sharp jawline catching the lamplight, and said, "You wanted more. These men will give it to you." My knees weakened not from fear, but from a dark, electric thrill. That first night began with Dan watching from the corner, arms crossed, silent, his dark eyes locked on me. Isaiah, a tattoo artist with a commanding presence, touched me first. His hands, larger than any I'd known, lifted me like I was weightless. His kiss was fierce, claiming my breath. Malcolm, a music producer with a flair for the dramatic, joined soon after, his touch deliberate, hungry. The 3 of us moved like a wildfire, crashing and burning. I screamed, moaned, begged things I'd never done with Dan. And the strangest part, Dan never looked away, his face unreadable, absorbing every sound I made. When it ended, I lay on the rug, sweat-soaked, legs trembling. Isaiah handed me a glass of water. Malcolm kissed my inner thigh and murmured, "We're just getting started." Dan said nothing. He handed me a towel, kissed my forehead as always, and went upstairs to sleep. Sleep didn't come for me. My body hummed with a life I hadn't thought possible. I felt alive, desired, possessed. The next day, I braced for guilt or shame. But nothing came. Instead, I texted Isaiah, then Malcolm. I needed that rush again. Dan kept bringing them back, sometimes separately, sometimes together. At first, I thought he was trying to save our marriage, but I soon realized it wasn't about love. It was about watching me spiral. I changed. I started wearing heels around the house, silk slips with nothing underneath. I unearthed a version of myself I'd buried years ago. One night, Dan asked. "Still want more?" I said. "Yes," without hesitation. Then he said the coldest words I'd ever heard. "Maybe I should stop being your husband and start being your manager." The room went quiet. I laughed nervously, thinking it was a joke, but his eyes were hard, serious. That moment shifted everything. Dan wasn't my partner anymore. He saw me as a product to manage. It started with late-night messages. "Isaiah, you good for tomorrow? Malcolm, we miss you. Girl." I went from Dan's wife to something else, a woman scheduled between two commanding men, a secret kept alive by desire. And, oddly, I craved it. Dan stopped touching me entirely, no more forehead kisses. No, "I love you" before work. He turned cold, clinical, like a businessman handling a brand he'd lost interest in. He'd dictate my sessions. "They're here at 6. Be ready. Wear red." Then came Xavier Cole, a boxing coach, taller, leaner, quieter than the others, his eyes burning with intensity. He touched me like I was fragile, yet sinful. By the end of that night, I was sore, breathless, unable to speak. I started losing myself. Dan began accepting payments cash from strangers. Rumors swirled. My husband was selling me. He said, "You wanted more. Now they're lining up." I couldn't face the mirror anymore. Not out of shame, but because I didn't recognize the woman staring back, bold, wanted, but shadowed by something darker. One evening, Dan sat me down and poured red wine, heavy and bitter. "You're more alive than ever," he said. "Admit it." I nodded. He was right, but a knot tightened in my chest. "Why are you doing this?" I asked. He smirked, his eyes glinting. "Watching you change was thrilling at first, but now I see power control. If I can control you, I can control anyone. I can control." The wine glass slipped from my hand, shattering on the hardwood, red splattering my feet like blood. That night, I saw the truth. I hadn't just betrayed Dan, I'd unleashed a monster within him. Things darkened. Dan started recording lights, cameras, professional equipment. He called it art. I called it exploitation. I screamed, begged him to stop, but he only smiled. "You can't stop now," he said. "You wanted more. Worst of all, a part of me still craved it. The pleasure and horror split me in two. One day, I'd sob in the shower, curled like a child. The next, I'd lose myself with Isaiah, consumed by the intensity. I stopped seeing friends, ignored my mother's calls, skipped my niece's birthday. I lived for those sessions, those texts, those knocks at the door, that raw thrill. But everything changed when I opened the guest room closet and found folders labelled Organised March Isaiah, April Malcolm, May Xavier, June VIP submissions. Each contained DVDs, USBs, contracts with my name. I wasn't a wife anymore. I was a business. I confronted Dan, screamed, slapped him. He didn't flinch. "I built something from your hunger. he said. You said I wasn't enough, so I made you too big for me. Now everyone wants you.
My body shook, not with fear but with clarity. I was no longer his wife, I was his product. That night, I packed a bag, hands trembling as I zipped it. My phone, purse, and keys were gone. Dan stood in the hallway, arms crossed. "You're not leaving," he said. "You belong here." I ran to the living room, but the door was locked. I collapsed on the bed, sobbing. But deep down, I knew this wasn't the end. It was just beginning. Weeks passed since that last night with the men Dan brought into our lives. I became hollow, no moans, no tears, just silence. A bitter silence infected our home like a plague. Dan wasn't just my husband anymore. He was the twisted director of my days and nights. He recorded everything: cameras in the bedroom, bathroom, tiny microphones in the kitchen. He claimed it was for protection, for control, but I knew he wanted to own every breath I took. He invited more men, new faces. Older, younger, rougher. One night, I counted 5. I couldn't cry anymore. My body numbed, my soul detached. I wasn't a woman, I was an exhibit, a thrill machine. But something stirred inside me. Quiet at first, then louder, a rage. Not just at Dan, but at myself. I'd asked for more, and I got it. But at what cost? It was a grey, cold Friday. Dan was out, supposedly at the gym. I stood in the living room, in just a robe. My reflection in the dark TV screen, a stranger's red-rimmed eyes, cracked lips. Then I saw it, Dan's laptop, left open on the kitchen counter. He never left it behind. I approached it like a loaded weapon and opened a folder labelled Pleasures. My stomach churned hundreds of videos, different men, different angles, different nights. They'd been uploaded, sold, monetized. My husband had turned me into a commodity. I wasn't a wife. I was property. That broke me. I ran, not just physically, but emotionally, mentally. I fled to a neighbour I barely knew, Rachel Evans, a schoolteacher who'd once left a casserole at our door years ago. I poured out everything: the men, the cameras, the betrayal. She listened, then hugged me and called the police. Dan was arrested 2 hours later at the gym. As I'd suspected, the police found it all footage, hard drives, bank transfers. He'd made over $300,000 from my degradation, escorted back to pack. I walked through the bedroom where I'd once been cherished, then discarded. I passed the kitchen where my moans had drowned out music. I stopped at the hallway mirror where I'd applied lipstick for each visitor. I met my own eyes. I wasn't ashamed, I was furious. But beneath that fury, I felt a spark of freedom. The aftermath. Rebuilding from ashes. Dan's arrest marked the end of one nightmare and the beginning of another. The police station was cold, the fluorescent lights harsh against my raw nerves. I gave my statement, my voice steady despite the tremor in my hands. The officers were kind but clinical, their questions probing yet detached. They assured me Dan would face serious charges: exploitation, illegal surveillance, abuse, and a litany of other crimes. I nodded, but the words felt distant, like they belonged to someone else's story. Returning to the house to gather my belongings was surreal.
The once warm suburban home in Cincinnati felt like a mausoleum, its walls heavy with memories of betrayal. I packed quickly, grabbing only essentials: clothes, a few books, my grandmother's locket. I couldn't bear to take anything that reminded me of Dan or the life we'd built. The hallway mirror caught my eye one last time. I didn't see the bold, desired woman I'd become in those fevered months, nor the broken shell of the night I fled. I saw someone new, fragile but resolute, a woman determined to reclaim herself. I signed away the house the next day. Its walls knew too much, held too many ghosts. With the little money I had left, I rented a small studio apartment near Lake Erie, in a quiet Cleveland neighborhood where no one knew my name. The apartment was modest peeling paint, a creaky radiator, a single window overlooking the lake's grey expanse. But it was mine, a blank slate where I could start over. Therapy became my lifeline.
My therapist, Dr. Elena Martinez, was a soft-spoken woman with sharp eyes and an uncanny ability to cut through my defences. In our first session, I sat on her worn leather couch, clutching a tissue, unsure where to begin. "Just start with the truth," she said. So, I did. I told her about Dan, about the hunger that led me to Isaiah, Malcolm, and Xavier, about the cameras, the money, the betrayal. I told her about the part of me that still craved the thrill, even as it tore me apart. She listened without judgment, her pen scratching notes, her silence a safe harbour. "Guilt is a heavy thing," she said after I'd poured out my story, "but it's not your burden alone. You didn't create this trap. Dan exploited your desires, weaponized them. You're not defined by what he made you do." Her words were a lifeline, but they didn't erase the weight. I spent weeks unraveling the layers of shame, anger, and confusion. Therapy wasn't a quick fix. It was a slow, painful excavation. Some days, I'd leave her office feeling lighter, like I'd shed a piece of the past. Others, I'd cry in my car, the lake's waves a distant roar, wondering if I'd ever feel whole again. I cut my hair a short, choppy bob, nothing like the long waves Dan loved. I stopped wearing lace, trading it for soft cotton and denim, clothes that felt like me, not the woman I'd become for him. I avoided mirrors for a while, not out of shame, but because I was still learning who I was. The woman in the reflection was a stranger, but she was mine to rediscover. The hardest part was the silence. I'd cut ties with most of my old life friends who'd heard the rumours, family who couldn't meet my eyes. My mother called once, her voice tight with worry, but I wasn't ready to explain. I sent a text promising I'd call soon, but soon stretched into weeks. I felt alone, but not lonely. The solitude was a chance to rebuild, to listen to my own thoughts without Dan's voice or anyone else's drowning them out. I started writing as a way to process. Not stories or poems, but raw confessions, poured onto pages I never planned to share. I wrote about the thrill of those nights, the shame of my complicity, the rage at Dan's betrayal. The words were messy, jagged, but they were mine. One sleepless night, I posted a piece online, anonymously, on a forum for survivors of betrayal. I didn't expect a response, but within hours, messages flooded in. Women from across the country, strangers from Seattle, Miami, Chicago shared their stories.
Some had been betrayed by partners, others by their own choices. One woman, a single mother from Texas, wrote, "I thought I was broken forever, but your words made me feel seen." Another, from New York, said, "You're not your mistakes. You're what you do next." Those messages saved me. I wasn't alone. My story, as raw and ugly as it was, connected me to others carrying their own hidden scars. I started a blog, still anonymous, calling it From Ashes. I wrote about the fire that consumed me, the choices that burned my life down, and the slow work of rebuilding. The blog grew, not because I was special, but because pain is universal. Readers commented, emailed, shared their truths. I found a community in the shadows, a network of women piecing themselves back together. I began attending a support group in Cleveland, recommended by Dr. Martinez. It met in a community centre, a small circle of women in folding chairs, sipping weak coffee from paper cups. The first time I went, I sat silently, arms crossed, afraid to speak. But week by week, I opened up. I shared fragments of my story, and they listened, nodded, understood. One woman, Sarah, a nurse with kind eyes, became a friend. Over coffee outside the group, she told me about her own escape from an abusive marriage. "You don't have to be perfect," she said. "You just have to keep going." Keeping going meant small steps. I got a part-time job at a local bookstore, shelving novels and recommending thrillers to customers. It wasn't glamorous, but it was honest work, and the quiet of the store soothed me. I started running along the lakefront, the cold air stinging my lungs, my breath sinking with the waves. I wasn't running from anything anymore, I was running toward myself. Dan's trial loomed on the horizon, a storm I couldn't avoid. His lawyer sent letters, offering deals, claiming Dan was remorseful. I refused to respond. He didn't deserve my voice, my forgiveness, or my time. The police had enough evidence videos, financial records, even testimony from Rachel, who'd become a fierce ally. I prepared to testify, not out of vengeance, but because I needed to speak my truth in a courtroom, to reclaim the narrative he'd stolen. The night before the first hearing, I sat in my apartment, the lake shimmering under a crescent moon. I wrote a letter to Dan not to send, but for myself. I poured out my anger, my pain, my regret, but also my resolve. "You broke me," I wrote, "but you didn't destroy me. I'm rebuilding, and this time, it's for me." I burned the letter in a small metal bowl, the flames curling the paper to ash. It felt like a ritual, a cleansing. The trial was grueling. Seeing Dan in court, his tailored suit unable to hide the hollowness in his eyes, was surreal. He didn't look at me, not once. The prosecution presented the evidence hard drives, bank statements, contracts. I took the stand, my voice steady, recounting the manipulation, the cameras, the betrayal. The defense tried to paint me as complicit, but Dr. Martinez's testimony about coercion and trauma silenced their arguments. The jury deliberated for 2 days. Dan was convicted on multiple counts: exploitation, illegal surveillance, and abuse. He faced years in prison. As the verdict was read, I felt no triumph, only relief. A chapter closed, but my story wasn't over. After the trial, I focused on healing. I joined a writing workshop, not for publication but for expression. The other writers, poets, novelists, memoirists, became a new kind of family. One, a retired teacher named Margaret, encouraged me to keep blogging. "Your voice matters," she said. So, I did. From ashes grew, and I started using my real name Lila, not the pseudonym I'd hidden behind. It was a small act of courage, but it felt monumental. I reconnected with my mother, inviting her to my apartment for coffee. She cried when she saw me, not out of pity, but pride. "You're stronger than I ever knew," she said. We talked for hours, rebuilding a bridge I thought I'd burned. My niece, now 8, sent me a drawing of a phoenix, scribbled in crayon with the words, "You're my hero." I framed it above my desk. I started dating again, cautiously. A co-worker at the bookstore, Tom, a quiet man with a love for sci-fi novels, asked me out for coffee. I hesitated, afraid of repeating old patterns, but his gentle humour and patience disarmed me. Our first date was simple, a walk along the lake, sharing stories about our favourite books. He didn't know my past, and I didn't tell him, not yet. But for the first time, I felt a spark that wasn't destructive, a warmth that didn't burn. The blog became a platform for advocacy. I partnered with a local non-profit supporting survivors of domestic abuse, sharing resources and stories. I spoke at a fundraiser, my voice shaking but clear, telling a room of strangers how I'd survived. The applause was quiet, but the hands that reached for mine afterward, women, men, survivors, felt like a lifeline. I wasn't just rebuilding, I was helping others do the same. One night, a year after the trial, I sat by the lake, a notebook in my lap. The waves lapped at the shore, steady and unyielding. I wrote about the fire I'd chased, the one that consumed my marriage, my identity, my life. I wrote about the ashes left behind and the woman rising from them. I wasn't perfect some days. I still felt the pull of that old hunger, the temptation to lose myself in chaos. But I was learning to choose differently. I thought of Dan, now a shadow in a cell, his power stripped away. I thought of Isaiah, Malcolm, Xavier, men who'd been pawns in his game, unaware of the full scope of his betrayal. I thought of Rachel, whose kindness had saved me, and Sarah, whose friendship had steadied me. I thought of the women online, their stories woven into mine, a tapestry of survival. Asking for more didn't make me evil, but losing sight of boundaries nearly destroyed me. I was greedy, foolish, chasing a flame that burned everything down. But from the ashes, I found something new, peace. Not in the absence of pain, but in the courage to face it. I'm rebuilding, one brick at a time, not for power or pleasure, but for myself. For Lila, the woman I'm becoming, the one who chooses peace. Thank you for reading my story. It's raw, painful, and deeply human, and I hope it speaks to you. Keep going, keep healing, keep rising. You're not alone.